Until, and it's very, I have an entire chapter on this in my book, and I believe I located 9 occasions on which Douglas and John Brown met over the 10 years, 11 years they knew each other. But where Douglas parted ways with John Brown is when he learned that the raid was going to be at Harper's Ferry, the largest arsenal in the United States. He still went down to, as you know, went down to Pennsylvania and met with John Brown in a stone quarry for 48 hours near Chambersburg to try to talk Brown out of it. What Douglas was attracted to, I'll get to Lincoln in a second, what Douglas was attracted to was John Brown's long discussion, vague discussion. Sorry for the John Brown Sainthood Club. I turned in my key to that a few years ago, but Douglas supported Brown when the plan was what Brown had once called the subterranean passageway, which was supposed to be this series of forts somehow manned by lots of men. It was going to be a kind of militarized underground railroad. Douglas was so desperate by the late 1850s, he was willing to keep supporting it, and he raised money for it. But when he found out Brown was going to attack the largest federal arsenal, he said, no, I'm out of here. Lincoln's reaction to John Brown was a typical Republican anti-slavery reaction. Lincoln's reaction to John Brown was to condemn the acts, which he did, and argued that John Brown deserved to be hanged. At the same time, Lincoln and many of the Republicans would then still focus the story back onto the issue of slavery, and if we don't solve this problem, do something about this problem, we will have more violence and more John Browns. That was the Republican move, of course, that scared the you-know-what out of Southerners. And they were already scared of Lincoln and scared of the Republican Party. So in a sense, they're not that far apart, although there were no letters from Abraham Lincoln in John Brown's trunk that they found in Maryland, which there were from Douglas, which is why a posse was out trying to capture him up in Rochester.
Would you think it fair to say that both of them feared the effect of John Brown's raid in getting the South to dig in its heels further and moving the South further towards secession?
Possibly Lincoln feared that more than Douglas did, because Douglas had long yearned for some kind of break, some kind of action, something that would force a collision and a conflict between North and South that would lead to some kind of sanctioned violence. Ironically, the war that actually comes, like it or not, was Douglas's fondest dream. And when it did come, the war propagandist came out in him in some of the ugliest, most vehement ways you'll ever read war propaganda. I suspect Lincoln had greater fear about that, oh my God, now, how do you hold this thing together in the wake of John? Well, Lincoln's first task was to get elected. I mean, he goes to give the Cooper Union speech in the wake of John Brown's raid. So Lincoln has a whole different problem on his hands, as does the whole Republican Party in the wake of John Brown.
Thank you.
Yes. Last question. Come on, you get one more. Go for it. Oh, here we go. All right.
Well-traveled man, Frederick Douglass.
Yes. Possibly more miles than anyone in the 19th century.
Did he have a green book?
Yes and no. It wasn't a green book. Abolitionists from the 1840s on, when he joins the Garrisonian itinerants, stayed wherever they had friends. It wasn't unlike what we now know as the Green Book. They would stay in private homes. They would stay in taverns and hotels, wherever they found friendship. Early on in his career, this was always a difficult issue. Douglas and this itinerant group he traveled with, particularly in the early 1840s, which was a series of from 3 to 5 abolitionists, including Abby Kelly, who was the star, the woman star of the abolition movement. In fact, Douglas's first couple of years out on the circuit, he was second fiddle to Abby Kelly, until he wasn't. They would stay with friends, but they would often go into towns and just leaflet the town and say, hey, we'll speak today over here if somebody will let us in. Often they couldn't speak in certain churches because they wouldn't let them in. They were too dangerous and so forth. When he does these enormous speaking tours, say after the war, year after year after year, thousands of miles at a time, 3,000 and 4,000 miles at a time, 35 and 40 lectures over a period of 3 months, 2 months, 3 months. He had all kinds of lists of places, friends. If you went to Beloit, Wisconsin, there was that family who would put you up. If you were in Iowa City, there was that family who would put you up. But he stayed in a lot of taverns and hotels as well, which got him into all kinds of Jim Crow situations. If you've read the book, you know this. Douglas was Jim Crowed more times than he could ever count. And with time, he began to process it through humor. Can I end on one quick story? Yeah, sure. He got, again, Jim Crowed so many times. His early years, he would react with outrage. I mean, physical outrage. When he'd get thrown off trains or thrown out of hotels. Later on, if he was stopped in a dining room of a hotel somewhere, and this is in the North, and he was told, you can't eat in the dining room, you must eat in the kitchen, he would often just stand up and as loudly in that booming baritone as he could, where do you feed your dogs? The dogs, where are the dogs? I'll eat with the dogs, where are the dogs? And pretty soon everybody in the dining hall is kind of coming to his aid. You know, and they're beginning, oh, Mr. Proprietor, let the man eat in the dining hall. No, I'll eat with the dogs. It's all right. Give me the dogs. Where are they? You know, and pretty soon the whole place is, well, at least the way he told it, the whole place was a chorus. Let him eat here. Let him eat here. You know, it didn't always work. It didn't work on steamers. And when you're on a steamer out somewhere, there's anywhere else to go but down to the lower deck. You know. Anyway, yeah, he had a kind of green book without it being green. So, thank you.
You're watching live coverage of the annual Abraham Lincoln Symposium from historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is American History TV on C-SPAN 3. We'll be back after a short break with Michael Burlingame. He holds a distinguished chair in Lincoln Studies at the University of Illinois, Springfield. He'll talk about Lincoln's actions as president-elect before his first inauguration in March 1861. For now, though, we go to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with our Cities Tour team to look at the African American Museum of Iowa.
The African American Museum of Iowa was built 15 years ago, and the purpose of the museum was to fill in the gaps that traditional education was not providing here in Iowa. There was African American contribution, achievement in Iowa, and just authentically shared stories that weren't a part of our regular educational system. Ironically, some of the founders of the museum were not from Iowa, and when they arrived here and began to work and spend time here, wondered about African American history and contribution in Iowa and decided to do a little digging to find out if there was enough out there to warrant a museum. And once they did do that, they found out that there was quite a bit of African American history in Iowa, and that was kind of the start of the museum.
The Driven by Hope exhibit is our newest temporary exhibit, and what we wanted to do was focus on African American migration, not just throughout the nation after the Civil War, but specifically to Iowa. This map of Iowa is depicting the African American population by each Iowa county for the year of 1870, which was one of the earliest census to actually be able to record African American population. And you can see by the map where the communities started. It's very heavy, first of all, along the southern border, because we're above Missouri. And as early back as when African Americans were enslaved, there were Underground Railroad routes that took you right up into Iowa. So you have some heavily populated areas starting, especially Henry and Lee County, but actually running all across the bottom. Another way migrants came into Iowa was the Mississippi River, which borders our state on the right. We were the first free state to get to from the south if you were traveling up the Mississippi. Often anybody who was migrating, which typically was young African American males, the idea was they would come north, get a job, secure some funding, send it back home with the hopes too that then their family could come up with them. They ultimately were trying to make their way as far north. Canada was a very popular place to go. Oftentimes they'd get off on the rafts, on the ships, they'd work the steamboats, and they would stop somewhere. They didn't have enough money to get further north up into Canada, so they would stop, do some work. They would find African American communities along the river, and they'd decide to stay. When African Americans got here and settled into some of these already established communities, they found most employment as being farmhands, barbers, laundresses, domestic servants. A big shift occurs when the railroads gain in popularity, which is about middle 1800s, which is true of the whole country. And as the railroads started moving west, Iowa was not missing out. And they were basically the gateway to the west. And the railroads were being built fast and furiously. Now, to run the railroads, they were steam engines, required coal. Another big push, big industry in Iowa was coal mining. Oftentimes, the actual mines were under contract with a particular railroad company, and they would supply coal just to that railroad company. Now, the African Americans that came to work on the railroads and to work in mining were brought here as strike breakers. So the coal mining companies, the railroad companies would actually send recruiters to the South to find able-bodied men willing to come up. They paid their way up here. They gave them stories of jobs aplenty and, potential to earn. A lot of them didn't know they were strikebreakers when they came up, and when they came and found more often than not a hostile environment, they were taking away jobs from those who were trying to unionize, trying to get more equal pay, better pay. So a lot of hostilities occurred with that. Now, one exception in Iowa is the coal mining town of Buxton. Now, it started out as the rest, strikebreakers coming up. The company, which was Consolidation Coal Company, was a bit unique in its practices in that when the strikes had ended, they actually would employ the strikebreakers, which typically was not done. They were given training, they were given places to live while they learned the trade. If they didn't know it, they didn't always choose experienced miners to come. This employment then allowed them to write letters home, to bring their families, to tell their friends, hey, there's work here, come here, there's land, there's work. And so the town just grew and grew and grew. What else was unique about Buxton was that the company, as near as we know, did not discriminate, equal pay for everyone. They allowed Black-owned businesses to thrive. So you had this burgeoning Black middle class. And it was a very prosperous time and a prosperous place to live. It is a very short-lived span of history. Buxton is about 1900, and it was in a severe decline by 1927. So we're only talking about a few decades. So the next surge of African American migrants to Iowa was in the Illinois Central Railroad strike that happened in Waterloo, Iowa around 1911. That it's the same type of thing as with the mining. The company did not want to allow unions. They did not want to deal with fair wages. So again, they brought up strikebreakers from the South, actually, that worked the same line in Mississippi. They brought them up by train to be strikebreakers in Waterloo. This did not go over very well with the citizens of Waterloo, who were very much behind the striking workers. And it was very difficult when the strikebreakers arrived. They really were not wanted. No one would rent to them. They had no money to buy homes. So what the railroad company did was actually set up a boxcar community. And single families, sets of workers, sets of families all shared one boxcar. So the hostilities of the people living in Waterloo, they were looking at a population that had very few African Americans, about 30 at the time. And in the span of a few months, you're looking at 400. So it was kind of a mass exodus in their eyes, and a kind of a takeover of their town in their eyes. They were really, really ostracized for being there. And so that the area that the boxcars were set up were right along the tracks, and it was dubbed Smoky Row. The press at the time kind of equated it with a devil's den kind of area, known for prostitution and gambling and that kind of thing, when all of those entertainments were owned by the white population. So they painted a picture, and unfortunately that area has had issues ever since in one way or another. There's still difficulties in Waterloo to this day. There is that's probably the highest African American population in the state. And there's still issues to be worked out there, but it does stem back this far to when the first large group had come up. So something to keep in mind is that all of this fluctuation of African Americans to Iowa is occurring decades before the Great Migration, which is most familiar in people's minds. The majority of people coming through during the Great Migration, the peak years of 1916 to 1918, and the Waterloo strike was 1911. Buxton is late 1800s. So there's a lot going on here before we have the mass exodus, and people are coming to more urban areas in the Northeast especially, but they're also making their way quite a bit through Chicago, and they're still also coming through Iowa. And often Iowa had been a second or a third migration. Those that had come to the big cities, well, they're coming from more rural areas. They're coming from farms, not all, but most, or smaller urban centers. And they find that the larger cities are just not, the opportunities that they were expecting to find just aren't there. And so they make a second or a third migration to a new state like Iowa, where you can purchase a piece of land, you can work on someone's farm. The cities are a lot smaller, a lot more manageable for people. After World War I, many African American troops felt and hoped that things would be different. They were fighting the war with their white counterparts. There was some equality there. They figured things are going to be different. Race relations are going to be better. Well, the opposite kind of winds up being true. 1919 is a year of, really between 1919 and 1921, national news of race riots in Chicago and Tulsa, white workers feeling that African Americans are continuing to take their jobs. In Iowa, as possibly in other states, where you had the rural railroad working and the farming and the mining, there's a shift away from those rural areas into the urban areas. Manufacturing is now bigger. The railroads are in decline. The mines are closing up. So you have this shift, as you can even see in the map, to more industrial areas. Waterloo now has jumped up between 1920 and 1930 to almost 1,200 African Americans. You have Cedar Rapids area in the 700s. There's a large movement into the urban areas. This is butting up against European immigrants who have come to work. It butts up against other whites who were coming back from war. So there's a lot of tension. It's also the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which was in Iowa, as well as many other states. The 20s was the largest decade for them. They actually had recruits going through the states and recruiting people to join the Klan. It was in the newspapers here in Iowa. Like I said, it was probably about a decade. They did hold some power positions in government, but it was short-lived. So part of the population that was moving to these urban centers included Buxton, that I had spoken about previously. The coal mining town was in a decline by 1927. There were actually recruiters that came from the meatpacking plants in Cedar Rapids to bring them to Cedar Rapids. So there was an exodus out of that area. Cedar Rapids was one urban center that they came to. Now, those that had grown up in Buxton, those that had only knew Buxton, were very shocked and dismayed of how life was like for an African American to live in one of these urban centers. They no longer had control over their job. They were given the most base, unskilled, hardest, difficult, extreme heat, extreme cold type of jobs that white workers didn't want to have. They were considered unskilled. It didn't matter if they actually did have skills. It was not a factor. And the realization that, okay, not every place is like Buxton. There isn't equal pay. To realize that not every place was like Buxton, and that it truly was hard living, and that racial disparity was just so rampant.
I think that it's important to share African American history because Black history is Iowa's history, and people are interested in learning more. We want that for our children. Oftentimes we have field trips where the students come through, and we'll hear later on that their parents come through and they tell us that they came because their students or their children told them about the African American Museum and what they learned here. So children are really what's kind of galvanizing adults to come in, and I think the current climate is, of course, creating an interest for people to come in and learn more about our shared history.
Our city's tour staff recently traveled to Cedar Rapids, Iowa to learn about its rich history. Learn more about Cedar Rapids and other stops on our tour at cspan.org/citiestour. You're watching American History TV, all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 3.
We now return to our live coverage from Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. with the annual Abraham Lincoln Symposium. This is American History TV on C-SPAN 3. Coming up on the Ford's Theater stage is Michael Burlingame on Lincoln as President-elect, from his November 1860 election until his March 1861 inauguration. American History TV has been at Ford's Theater in Washington all day today with the American Lincoln Symposium. And just a reminder, after the next speaker, there will be a speakers panel at 3:55, featuring the presenters responding to questions from the audience and from one another. And those speakers will be from earlier today, including James Takich, Richard Carradine, Nina Silber, David Blight, and Michael Burlingame. And of course, Ford's Theater is significant in relationship to President Lincoln, as he was in the presidential box with his wife Mary on April 14, 1865, for a performance of Our American Cousin. Actor John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln as he watched that play. The president died from his wounds the next morning.
We used to be at the library. Yeah, we moved out now.
I don't know what to do. They all have a room.
Yeah, I smoked that.
This is my favorite.
It's more composed. We started basically with John Sellers, St. John, was the first president.
Good afternoon. That's my way of saying good afternoon. I'm Lucas Morel, professor of politics at Washington and Lee University. Don't worry, I teach some Lincoln along with Washington and Lee. I first met Michael Burlingame about 20 years ago in the Holy Land, Springfield, Illinois. What struck me then has remained true through all these years, and that is Michael is the most generous scholar I have ever met. Even though he's been doing the legwork, crisscrossing this country and digging into all these archives and nooks and niches, he still loves to share these findings before he publishes them. He's not worried about being scooped. The grand culmination of this work, of course, was his monumental and mammoth 2-volume biography, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, what Professor Burlingame affectionately refers to as the Green Monster, received the Lincoln Prize in 2010. Along the way, he has published at least a dozen books at last count and earned many awards, including Illinois' highest honor, the Order of Lincoln. After teaching at Connecticut College for over 30 years and working on his biography, he joined the history department at the University of Illinois Springfield, where he has served as the Chancellor Naomi B. Lynn Distinguished Chair in Lincoln Studies since 2009. Please join me in welcoming the godfather of Lincoln research, here to speak about the Springfield dispatches of Henry Villard between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, my good friend, Professor Michael Burlingame.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Lucas. Lucas is not only a distinguished professor of political science and author on Lincoln, he's also my agent. And I'd also like to thank Professor Carradine for his kind remarks about my pinch hitting for him last year. And I'd also like to add a little footnote to Professor Carradine's talk. As he mentioned, Lincoln was very fond of off-color stories, and almost everybody that William Herndon interviewed after Lincoln's assassination who had known Lincoln well said Lincoln was very fond of off-color stories, but they were reluctant to tell Herndon any of those stories because they didn't want to besmirch the memory of their martyred friend. And so I was very excited years ago to discover in the Carl Sandburg papers at the satellite campus of the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana that that Sandburg had discovered these off-color stories. So I ransacked the papers of Sandburg at the University of Illinois and found a lot of good material for my book, but I didn't find any of those off-color stories. I was very disappointed. But then I was doing a little research at the Newberry Library in Chicago in a small collection of Sandburg materials, and there they were, the off-color stories. And I was